my name's my name is Rose Wallen. As Ginger mentioned, I work with Utah State University Extension. I'm down in the Emery County office, and I do a little bit. It's a small county, so I get to do a little bit of everything down here. But my background is in horticulture, and then I have a master's degree in landscape architecture. So we're going to talk a little bit about plants, maybe a little bit about landscape design and using herbs in our landscapes. I hope I'm not disappointing anybody. This is not going to be a recipe heavy class. So I don't know, I'll watch and see how many of you head out and go over to the permaculture discussion after I say that. But we're gonna be talking more about how to grow the herbs and maybe some of their uses, but I'm not going to give you a whole lot of tips and tricks on cooking. So I know that's disappointing, but we don't have too much time. So we'll go ahead and get started. If you've got questions for the Q&A, Ginger, if you want to break in, if there's something, if you'll watch that, and if there's something pertinent, if it's about specific herbs or your specific yard, maybe let's save those to the end. But if there's something that kind of fits in with our discussion as we're going along, or if I'm not making any sense, please break in and we'll go ahead with that as we go. So, all right, there we go. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about what herbs are. I think all of us have some ideas. Our definition is going to be a little bit different based on what kind of what group we're asking. So the botanical definition of an herb is going to really be we talk about herbaceous plants, so plants without woody stems. So some of the things that we might consider herbs, bay leaves or rosemary do have woody stems. So those wouldn't fit in the botanical definition. But if we move into the culinary definition, it's a little bit broader, but still sort of ambiguous. In the culinary definition, when we're using herbs for cooking, they tend to be plants that we use the leaf for flavoring, and then if we start using seeds, then they typically become spices, which is sort of a vague distinction in my mind. So we're going to talk about sort of broadly this group of plants that we use for many different purposes. So this broad group of herbs. So one of the ways that we use herbs is as food. So these are things that we eat on their own. Herbs tend to be kind of some of the distinction between a vegetable might be that we're using them more for flavoring than strictly as the main part of the meal. But these we have a long history of as a society of using herbs and plants as flavoring for our food. It's something that makes eating more exciting. You're only kind of seeing the top of me, but I'm kind of a chubby kid, and I definitely love to eat. So incorporating new flavors and exciting tastes into our food is something that I really enjoy. One of the other things that we use herbs for is as medicine. We use medicinal herbs. This is the one thing that I wanted to, I put my be careful disclaimer up here. I think you should do some research before you start using herbs as medicine. So I am not a doctor. I'm not going to give any medical advice other than to be careful. But I think there's a lot of bad information on the internet that I don't want to really debate with anyone here. But there are people that use herbs in ways that make me uncomfortable. And there are things that can interact with medications that may not be appropriate for everyone's situation. Now, I put the mint here. My mom's granny was born in England, and so our family has a firm belief that peppermint tea can cure just about anything. But I really think you should be smart when you're using herbs as medicine, and even things that you might buy at the store. Make sure that they're appropriate for what you're trying to do. All right. We also use herbs for scent. I love a scented garden. Lavender is one of my favorites. There are many herbs that we use and grow really not always just for their flavor, but for the smell that they impart. So the perfume industry uses huge amounts of botanicals for this purpose. And for those of you that are I know this is a urban kind of farm and homestead. I think some of you are probably interested in not just backyard gardening, but actually making a profit from some of your gardening enterprises. So this is one that might be interesting. Herbs could be something for used as scent. This could be something additional that you might consider in your farmers market uh, sales. In cosmetics as well, we use herbs in a lot of our soaps, lotions, shampoos, makeup, all kinds of things. Really, even the ones that don't specifically advertise that they're using botanicals. Oftentimes, if you read the ingredients, they're using distilled herbs in those formulations. This is another one that I think was interesting. It's something that I don't really know a lot about, but herbs and plants can be used as dye as well. I met I knew her from before, but I was recently talking to a local artist who does some really beautiful work with textiles, and she was using botanicals to dye some of those. So it's another thing that herbs can be used for. And then this one is something that I think is interesting, that herbs can be used as landscape plants. So I don't know if you all recognize this plant in the image here, but this is creeping thyme, which is perfectly edible. It has a nice flavor, but it has become a lot of people are using this one as a xeric, a water-wise landscape plant, because it doesn't use a whole lot of water in it, and it's pretty and it smells nice. There's lots of reasons for that, but herbs don't have to be used strictly for food. They can be used as landscape plants as well, some of those varieties. I know when I lived in New Mexico, that rosemary was commonly used as a shrub. It's a beautiful and fairly water-wise shrub that I don't know that most of us can grow in Utah with our winters, but it is an option for maybe some people in southern Utah or with a specific microclimate. All right, so getting started. Let's see if I can pull up the Q&A. Let's see. Okay. All right. When I'm going to look at the questions here, some of these I think we're going to get to. When I do say medicine, yes, I think using herbs as teas. You can use. There are definitely herbal remedies that are put in tablet form that you can buy commercially. There's lots of options, but again, I would be safe with those. And there are some things that may not help, but could also be detrimental to your health as well. All right, so getting started. I think that when I've always really loved gardening, so I have spent a lot of time doing it. Starting with herbs are for most people, a very easy thing to grow. And one of the first things that I started growing it, kind of as a teenager, I was one of the things that I played around with some. But getting started, you can there's definitely the trial and error method. Most of the herbs are not most of them are not expensive to buy. And a lot of them are very forgiving as far as their growing requirements. So it's something to dabble with. But as we get started, I'm going to hopefully give you some ideas that might make your journey a little easier. Okay, so I told you that I was a landscape architect. I like a plan. I think that starting anything with a little bit of information and a plan is always going to help you have a better result at the end. And Now, whether this is a full scale, I'm designing out exactly where my herb garden is in my landscape and what herbs go where. It can be that detailed. But for some people, I think that maybe one of the things to consider as you're starting out is what to plant and what quantities to plant. So think about things that you actually enjoy eating or using for any of those other purposes that we mentioned. So think about the ones that you enjoy. I would also, experiment with some things that you might have heard about. If you've got a recipe that calls for something that you've never really tried before, maybe that could be something you could try growing. But thinking about some of the things that you actually like, and then what quantities are appropriate. So for me, I like a wide variety of herbs in many different cuisines, but there are things like sage is, I think, a very pretty plant to grow, one that's easy to grow. But I don't use it very frequently. It's kind of the star of my grandpa's Thanksgiving turkey dressing, but the rest of the time, I think it's a little strong. It takes over, and it's not something that I use large quantities of. So planting, huge areas of sage doesn't work for me, and it might work for you. It may be something that you enjoy more than I do. So then I included this picture right here, this basil. So another one that I really like, I think a lot of us do, but if we're incorporating basil, a lot of us want to make pesto sauce with it. One little plant is usually not enough to make a whole batch. So if making sauce is something that you're interested in, you're going to need to plant several of these plants in order to have the quantities that you need. So thinking about what you enjoy and how much of it you're going to actually need in order to use those things. All right. Okay. All right. The other thing that I think you should do kind of as you're planning out and beginning is to think about location. I think that this is one thing that is really going to make your use of the herbs something that really happens or something that doesn't. So I like this photo here. It shows some garden beds, kind of right outside the house. It has these pots that have herbs in them. I think that really the closer to your kitchen that your herb garden is, the more likely you are to actually use those herbs. The farther out you have to go to harvest those herbs fresh, it's going to be less likely that you're going to use them on a regular basis. So I have herbs around my yard that some of them are there mostly for as kind of landscape plants, but I have a small herb garden that is right outside my back door, and about 10 steps from the kitchen, and that's the one that gets used consistently as I'm cooking. And so that's always a little bit tricky as a landscape designer to figure out, all of the best locations for, the best arrangements for circulation and for function, and then putting those into the real world with your exact situations sometimes can be a little tricky. So ideally, you want it to be somewhere close to your kitchen. As you get started, there are, we're not going to spend a lot of time on starting seeds. That's a whole other lesson and conversation. But many of the herbs can be started pretty readily from seeds. There are a lot of them that will grow fairly easily. There are some that are trickier than others. Things like there are some that really are kind of tricky to start from seed. There is an old medieval. I was reading it was a medieval myth about starting parsley seeds, and it said that it took they took so long because they had to be put in the ground and travel down to the devil in hell before they came back up and sprouted. So it might give you some ideas that maybe that's not the easiest one to start from seed, but a lot of them really do lend themselves to this process. They can be started indoors and then moved outside. The other thing to consider too is that sometimes seeds are really the only way we might get a few of the less common herbs. So my mother was experimenting with some French recipes, and some of them called for summer savory. That's not an herb that you can find fresh very easily in the United States. So there were no local nurseries selling potted plants. I couldn't find it in the grocery store. And so she'd asked me about starting it from seed so she could make this recipe work. And that's one where I was able to order the seeds and get them started, and it worked just fine. So some of you that might have really specific ideas of things that you might want to try, seeds can be a great option for finding those less common varieties of plants that might not show up easily at your local nursery. Okay, some things are able to be started by cuttings, and things that can be rooted in soil. Some can be rooted in water pretty easily, and then a lot of herbs also. Many of our perennial herbs can be started and propagated by division. So this thyme here is one that could be shared with a friend or moved to other places in your yard pretty easily by just dividing up that root crown and spreading those plants to another spot in your garden. The thyme in particular, and I think that's one to mention, I guess, for people that are interested in using it as a landscape plant, is that I've noticed it really it's a pretty perennial, a nice ground cover, and it spreads, but it tends to kind of die out in the center where you actually started it. So you may have to move those around just a little bit to get them to stay where you want them. All right, we also have modified stems. So there are things here, particularly the chives and onion, that family is most easily spread with modified stems like bulbs. Ginger, you're on the screen. Do we have a question?
I'm wondering if you have your slideshow in a Zoom mode.
Oh, is it not? Are we not seeing any of this?
Well, we're seeing it, but it's blown up, so we're
Blown
not
up
seeing
really
a lot
big.
of the
Oh, shoot.
labels.
Okay.
It was fine when we first started, but
Okay, we can
I don't know when it changed. It's like it was in a different mode.
Is that any better?
No, that's the same right now.
That's the same. Okay.
So sometimes your labels are like completely off the screen.
Really? Huh.
Is your browser in a Zoom mode or
see.
something? Or
I think
that
so.
doesn't make sense.
Let's try it again. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry for breaking in. I just thought maybe you'd like to know.
Well, sure. I would like to know. Yeah. Let's see.
So if you just...
I don't know if that's any better.
No, it's still the same.
Okay. Well.
Now some people are seeing it fine.
Okay.
So just ignore me. Maybe
well,
I've got
I
something
apologize.
wrong with my screen.
Most of this, I will say, I'm a pretty visual learner, so most of this is going to be pretty pictures. There's not a lot of text on most of these slides anyway. So
we won't worry about it.
You'll be okay if you just look at the pretty plants and listen to the crazy man drone on. So,
very good.
All right, so let's see, division. So yes, we can also, a lot of our herbs are easily spread through through modified stems. So that particularly the chive onion family is an easy one. We also have, I'm not sure if we really classify horseradish and ginger are culinary. I don't know. They don't quite fit vegetable. I'm not sure if they quite fit our definition of herb either, but they're also ones that are propagated with those stems and modified roots and stems. So, all right. As we think about our growing requirements, this is something to consider. So I mentioned trying to get our herb gardens close to where we want them, close to our houses. But we also have to think about how to really make the plants themselves happy. So if we're going to be successful, we have to think about some of those growing conditions. One of the first to consider is light. And this one is really, I think this one is key, and one that's tricky sometimes in the Intermountain West. We have such really high solar intensity that those nursery tags don't always tell us the whole story when they say full sun. So generally speaking, most of our herb varieties are going to like full sun, with a few caveats here. So and really with one of the caveats being that sun is great, but if you have a spot that has a little bit of shade or partial shade, most of the time we're getting strong enough sun at least part of the day to make those plants pretty happy. Now there are a few specific herbs that I wanted to mention that are really going to do a little bit better, maybe with a little bit of shade. So a lot of us really like cilantro. I know it's kind of one of those polarizing love it or hate it sort of plants, but I personally like it. And I mentioned earlier, basil is one that I think a lot of us really like. And those two, oftentimes you would see on the labels that they're going to tell you full sun. And what's tricky about that in Utah is that oftentimes we have very strong sunlight, and it heats things up and causes those two herbs in particular to bolt pretty quickly. What I mean by that is that they switch from creating leaves to their fruiting stage. They start creating seeds and flowers, and that's not what we actually like. So I don't know if I'm going to blow your mind here, but cilantro and coriander are the same plant. When we eat the seeds is what we usually call coriander. And if you like those seeds, then maybe you would want that plant to go to seed pretty readily. But for a lot of us, we like the leafy part, and basil, we definitely don't want the flowers. We want to create as much leaf, as many leaves as we possibly can. So putting those in a shadier, cooler spot can help to sort of prolong that period before they start seeding and flowering. So we can try to play around with that just a little bit. All right. The other one to consider is the soil. And now this is one where I think that herbs are great as sort of an entry level gardening project, because for the most part, they're really not too fussy on soil. Many of them can live in pretty hard conditions, and so that's okay for a lot of us, especially in Utah. Most of us don't have very good soil, so this is something that we can work with pretty well. What most herbs do not like is having roots that stay really wet. So if you do have a very kind of heavy, thick clay, that's something that you might want to try to break up by adding compost or organic matter, to try to get that to drain a little better, or adjust your watering to make sure that the soil isn't staying wet for too long. That is the one thing that that the majority of them really can't handle as far as soil goes. But anything else, rocky, not too fertile, bad, just not ideal soils are generally fine. Water is again, so we talked about most of these plants are not going to enjoy being waterlogged or staying moist. But watering, this is one where a lot of the herbs that we see used as landscape plants are used strictly primarily for the reason that they are sort of water-wise plants. They're using a lot less water than some of our other landscape plant options. So using them, these don't need to be watered too frequently. But if you want, leafy production of those plants, then they need to be watered fairly consistently. So I think it depends a little bit on what your goals are here. If you're using them as a landscape plant, maybe they can handle more drought. If you are looking to have, that leaf production and really want to be eating them, or using them for, fragrance, whatever else, then you might want to use more water. Fertility, again, like I said, they don't need particularly fertile soil. You don't typically need to be adding a whole lot of fertilizer. A simple, really any kind of fertilizer, just adding a little bit more nitrogen to encourage some leafy growth is going to be really what we want here. So, whatever type of fertilizer works for you, whether that's organic, conventional, or just kind of waiting and seeing how they perform before you add anything, are both, any of those are great options. All right, and then pests. There are not a ton of pests for most of our herb varieties. They're actually, that's one of the advantages. There are not a lot of pests that are attacking them, and some of the pests that do regularly attack some of these plant varieties tend to not be really native to Utah. So there are some things on the East Coast. There some caterpillars that we don't typically get many of here. Some of the things that might attack some of our herb plants are we can get spider mites, and a lot of times that happens when the plants become drought stressed. So appropriately managing watering can help with those. And then some of there are some species, things like basil that may get that can be susceptible to diseases like powdery mildew. Again, oftentimes appropriate watering and good cultural practices can help alleviate some of those problems. Right. So creating herb gardens. I told you that I liked landscape design. So we're going to look at a few options, and not in too terribly much detail, but there's always the option of creating just an informal herb garden. I think that a lot of people be surprised how often people ask me about the English country garden look, and sort of an informal herb garden or incorporating herbs into designs like that really could work well. These plants don't necessarily need to be planted in straight rows or anything like we often see in very strict traditional vegetable gardens. Oftentimes they're just kind of free form, and they might change around a little bit. Many of our herb species are perennial, so they're coming back every year, and they might get a little bigger or kind of change the locations in our gardens as they grow for a few seasons. But this informal look is very simple and attractive, in my opinion, in a lot of cases. We can also do there are very formal herb gardens that can be really quite beautiful as well. I really like the very straight lines in this garden. It's easy to walk through. And then they've taken some time to plant some of these in patterns. We've got, I believe that's lavender, and then some of our others are planted in kind of rows and patterns, even within these pretty rigid shaped beds. So I think this can also be very attractive. There are also very, very formal herb gardens. This is a cathedral garden with boxwood hedges, kind of creating these beautiful patterns, and then herbs, flowers. We've got some medicinal and culinary herbs within these beds. There are also, I think a lot of us may have seen, I couldn't find a great photograph for this, but a lot of us might have seen some of those knot gardens using boxwood or sometimes even rosemary to create hedges that are in sort of a kind of a Celtic knot shape. Those can be really beautiful. A lot of work to maintain, and I think it really depends on kind of your goals for that, whether it needs to be something formal and beautiful here. In this cathedral, I think that I think part of the reason for this spacing is being able to sort of walk through this in sort of a very meditative fashion, and be able to have that ordered walking experience with the beautiful colors and scents throughout that garden. The other one that I wanted you to consider is container gardens. I think that container gardening has really a lot to lend itself to the idea of growing herbs. There's a lot of good things to be said for container gardening. So container gardening can be really anything. This can be flower pots in your kitchen window, which I usually do most all winter long. My family, I think they're coming around to the idea of the fresh herbs in the kitchen window. For a while, they were like, "Why are we eating out of the flower pots?" But yeah, it's a great way to have those fresh herbs in the house all season long by putting them in containers. I usually have some herbs in containers outside in the summertime as well. Some things just there are things like some herbs can be a little aggressive if they're planted in the ground. So things that spread very easily by runners or through their roots. Mint, which I mentioned really liking, but it can be one that is a little hard to contain in the ground. Sometimes it spreads pretty easily, and so putting that one in a container kind of makes sense to me. I talked a little bit about different requirements in sunlight, and putting things in pots or in containers gives us a chance to experiment with that in your own yard. So you may start something in a pot that you think that it might need more sun, and if it gets a little crispy, you could consider moving that container somewhere that's a little shadier. You have a chance to move those around and sort of fine tune some of the requirements for those particular plants. I also like the idea of having some of these individual varieties separated. So, there are, I've known people that want the Simon and Garfunkel song, the parsley, is it parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme? I'm not going to sing for you, but parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme. Those are the ones they want in their garden, and they don't all work perfectly. They don't have exactly the same requirements. So, the parsley might like a little more water than some of those others. And so putting them in their own containers lets you kind of give each particular plant what they like exactly. If you are going to have containers that have multiple varieties of plants in there, then you need to make sure that particularly their watering requirements are matched. And then, obviously their sun requirements, if matching those can be helpful. The one thing that I'll say with that too is that if you do plant something tall and then put something in a similar container, in the same container, something that may like some shade, sometimes that can actually help with that as well by putting them in the container so one is shading the other. But containers are, like I said, a great way to really experiment a little bit and be able to grow things under ideal conditions for each individual plant. So I wanted to talk a little bit as well about harvesting. So this one, okay. So there are a few things to consider when you're going to be using the herbs. So a lot of times, I've heard people say that the flavor might be better in the morning or in the evening. I tend to cut things as I'm cooking, so they get harvested whenever that happens to be. And I've not noticed a huge amount of difference in the flavor from morning to evening, but there are some differences in flavor by season, and if we allow things to go to flower, then that can be a little tricky as well. So so harvesting, we want to do this really we want to cut leaves when we have a good amount of leaves. Once the plant is leafy and is growing well, then we can harvest some of the leaves and allow it to grow back. We also want to try to do this before these plants flower. Sometimes we can stop this by cutting out flower stalks, but oftentimes the flowering is going to change the flavor. So the chives, I don't know if you were able to see the photo back there or not. I don't know what's going on with the presentation, but chives can have a really sort of pretty purple flower. And if you're going for just a landscape plant, allowing that to flower can be a nice thing. But once those chive plants have flowered, they tend to be a little more bitter. So the leaves are not going to be as flavorful for you once those plants have flowered. And again, things like our cilantro, our parsley, basil, some of those we would want to maybe keep clipping the flowers out so that we're able to keep them in a vegetative state longer and keep harvesting those leaves. As we harvest too, I believe in this picture, if you can see the edge, this person is using some scissors. That's what I typically use. I have some scissors in my kitchen window that are used strictly for harvesting herbs. You can use hand clippers, whatever works for you. I would recommend if you're going to be, I would use something specifically for harvesting your herbs. A pair of scissors that's just for that purpose, or a pair of pruners that's just for herbs, so that you're not moving. If you use your same pruners in many spots around your garden, you might be moving diseases. You might also be moving sap or things that may not be particularly edible. Maybe not. You won't necessarily poison yourself, but they may not taste nice if you're moving some of those different plant residues around. So I would use something strictly for your herb garden, or make sure that you're cleaning your instruments before you go out and harvest. And then cutting through the leaves. And I wouldn't recommend that you if you're going to be, we generally want to be harvesting and reharvesting as things grow. If we pull the plants or kind of pick them, we tend to do more damage to the plant and make it harder for it to grow back. So if we're kind of wanting to harvest and then reharvest later on, it's usually better to do a nice clean cut that allows the plant to grow back more quickly. I blathered on enough about harvesting there. I'm trying to think if there was anything else that I wanted to mention. But yes, so clipping them as you're going to be using them, and then rinsing, cleaning those herbs as you go. I wanted to talk a little bit about storage as well. So This picture here is kind of the classic. We have this image of, you know, beautiful flowers hanging in bunches. That can work. You know, if that is what you're interested in, that's definitely a way to go. We can also dry herbs using, you know, using trays. We can put them in, you know, brown paper bags. I like the clean pillowcase hung on the clothesline. You just have to remember to make sure that the sprinklers are not going to come on when you have those drying outside. But drying herbs is a time-tested classic way of storage. Once they're dried, they can store for a fair amount of time. Not all herbs store well dried. Sometimes the flavor is not as good once they are dried. So many of these, once they've been harvested and washed, many of them can be stored in the refrigerator for sometimes a week or so. I think oftentimes kind of in a damp paper towel can help them stay fresh for a little bit longer, but keeping them in the refrigerator for a while can help you prolong how long they're able to be used. Some herbs actually do well frozen as well. You can freeze some of these, and they will maintain their flavor a little better than the dried varieties. I've seen people you know, chopping some of these herbs up and then freezing them with a little water in ice cube trays that then you know, the ice cubes can be added to soups or sauces or whatever. Those are all options for storage. For me, I really like the fresh variety, and so my storage tends to be bringing them inside for the winter in flower pots and trying to grow the fresh version. Again, I'm the gardening nerd, so I like houseplants. That's something that works for me. But it can be another option is just having those fresh herbs moved around outside of your yard and actually brought indoors for those months.